Welcome back to The Christian Record. Today we have another one of our song spotlights, the song Jungle Music by the band Servant. It came off of the album World of Sand, which came out in 1982. Now this song is unique, not only for the band, but just in general, in that it addresses what was going on with the artists in Christian music in the early days of Christian music. So leading up from the 70s up to this time in 1982. Now to give a little bit of background, Servant was changing their sound a little bit by the time this album came around. They were kind of switching from a little bit more bluesy sound, which was similar to kind of the early Fleetwood Mac sound, and they were going to more of a Christian pop kind of a sound with a little more keyboards, kind of the catchier, quick tempo lyrics and vocals, but they were also still using theatrical elements in their live shows. That's kind of something they were known for doing. And even from the very first album up to this particular album, they were using spoken portions in some of the songs. So it's not uncommon in this particular song when we see, that lengthy spoken section that we get to at the end of the song. But this song even doesn't necessarily match the sound from World of Sand, in that it's more of a theme genre type of song. It matches, the theatrical portion and the satirical side of what they were doing, but it's definitely even a departure from their typical sound. It's got more of a repetitive melody that is straight out emphasized when they even start chanting unga, 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 which is basically they're trying to create that stereotypical jungle/African sound that people would have thought came out of that. Now that's kind of been changed in recent years, where people see the music and sounds that come out of that area a little differently, especially even after Paul Simon's Graceland kind of brought a new audience into that. But there's definitely was a stereotypical feeling about what that might have been at this time in 1982. So it's very much that style of music. And as far as the band and what they were trying to get across, the early bands were, making, headway, and they had fans and some success with the people that they were trying to reach, which is perfect. I mean, that's great. But as far as, getting support from the leaders and the churches of Christendom, they were basically rejected by the church as playing the devil's music. That would have been the way they would have said it. Just they were playing the devil's music. So while they had some fans, they weren't able to get a lot of support. A lot of bands basically didn't make it just because they didn't have enough support, behind them from the people actually in, the churches and Christian arena. So this basically is going right after that. Now, I have to say, as far as my church in particular, while it was a conservative church, there was not this concerted effort to shun and reject contemporary Christian music that was coming out at the time. Now, not necessarily, 1982, but even by 85 and 90s, it certainly was not something that was occurring. So I feel very blessed to have church members, the older church members that were very supportive and trusted us in the youth, that if it had good Christian lyrics, that's what they always wanted to know. They simply would say, hey, can I look at the lyrics? Can you tell me what that song says? Because sometimes, they couldn't, hear it themselves when the song was playing. So they would say, hey, can you give me the lyrics? Tell me what that song is about. They were always supportive and say, hey, that's great. as opposed to they just simply just didn't want us listening to the bad secular music that was out and getting influenced by the world. So as long as we had good Christian lyrics that we were listening to, they were super supportive. So it wasn't necessarily played, obviously, during services. I know I mentioned in a previous video about the Imperials and had some songs that were sung as specials in our services, but for the most part, it was not in the services. That was just outside the services that people would hear us listening to it. But we were definitely not shunned in any way from listening to it. With that said, I can definitely remember a greater effort to stop the spread of Christian rock. There were programs that were out, books that were out. They were dedicated to basically getting parents to see the dangers of Christian rock and to root it out of their homes. So I even have on a bookshelf a couple of the books that were against Christian rock. I basically keep them a little bit as maybe I would say as a joke, but also just to kind of remind myself of how we got here. So it's kind of good to look back and see, both sides, how they were looking at it. Now, there were even, books and albums, things like that were being put out, released by some of the artists in the 80s, early 90s as well, that were basically trying to counteract this movement from some of the Christendom. So these albums and books were basically trying to educate and to share how they were using music in order to reach the lost. And they were trying to get people on their side and say, hey, okay, yeah, I get it now. This is what you're doing. This is how you reach the people. And otherwise, maybe these people wouldn't be reached. So they were trying to do that in their ministries as well. In the case of Servant and this song, they basically take it head on with jungle music. So let's look at some of the lyrics. Now, there's definitely a lot of references to things that the churches or leaders might have been saying about the Christian music industry at the time and the artists, the long hair and whatever else. And so the song has a line that says, "In the bushes they lay hidden, we want to reach the heathen tribes," using a reference to the jungle. "But our methods are forbidden. Your music is outrageous, simply for the birds. God would have to stoop too low to understand your words." And then there's the section that pretty much is just chock full of stuff that would have been going on at the time. And it even has an echo part. So the echo part is just kind of as important as the main lines that they're saying. So it says, like the devil drumming, the devil's drumming, a satanic symphony, play it backwards, and you'll see the beat and all those minor notes are such a blasphemy. Such a blasphemy. So you look at the echo part, which says the devil's drumming. The term devil beat was definitely a very common term that was being used at that time. The drum itself was basically being said to hypnotize, be hypnotic to the youth to do bad things. If we look at music in general, go back as far as, Elvis was blamed, with the gyrating hips, and the Beatles with the, girls that screamed and swooned and fell over. So, there would be a point to be said about kind of the way that the music was affecting people in a secular world. It's a very spiritual experience. And is it a spirit of evil or is it a spirit of good? And that's kind of where this comes down to, in the sense that when we look at, the decadence of the 60s and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the things that people were doing in addition to, the beat and the songs, they were teaching people and trying to encourage people to do. Then you have the people come in the Jesus movement, and they're basically saying, hey, wait, yeah, that's not going to be working. Let's use that to bring people back and to have this spiritual awakening through music again, to bring people back to and redeem them to the ways of Christ. And so they were basically trying to say, no, you can still use music. Yes, it's a spiritual medium, but we're going to use it spiritually for good and bring people back to Christ. So that echo about, play it backwards and you'll see, that's a reference to backmasking. So secular artists were kind of getting into that, where you basically, especially on an LP, where you can kind of slowly turn the album backwards. It would have some things that it supposedly said, and Christian artists were getting accused of doing this because they just thought, well, the Christian artists are the same as the secular artist, but they were getting accused of doing it even though it wasn't something that was actually happening. So Petra actually later on, maybe a year or two later, would hit that head on as well with their song Judas Kiss, where they would put a Christian message purposely in there. So we'll probably talk about that again at some point. And then there's the refrain for this song, jungle music, could God use it? And so obviously trying to encourage people to realize that God can use these people in the medium that they are in to reach the lost. And I have to point out that, especially for Servant, because they didn't do this a lot, but their hardest, most aggressive guitar solo comes at this point in the song, and to me it just feels very blatant that they're in the face of the people who they're trying to talk to, saying, yeah, you think we're doing hard guitar solos? Well, listen to this. Blam! And there it is. So definitely in your face as far as the guitar solo at that point, which is not even the same style, stylistically, as the rest of the song with that African beat kind of thing that they got going. So I do find that guitar solo really interesting. It's an awesome guitar solo. You got to listen to it. And then they talk about the high notes that they sing, and this is probably obviously more about guys singing high notes. That would have been something that churches and others would have pointed out. And to be honest, if you look at 1982, they weren't doing that much of that compared to just a few years later. You start looking at the hair bands, and their tight jeans are allowing them to hit notes that even a dog can't hear. So it's just kind of one of those things to also kind of note in this song. So as it goes forward, it is talking about how they have to go elsewhere outside of the churches to play their music. And then it progresses to the line that says, when they all got saved that day, it really was no shock. No matter what the critics say, God uses righteous rock. And so that was pretty much what their point was, is that they're going out to the world, trying to basically do the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel, and they are reaching these people, and the people that are against them are denying that anybody is being reached through this music, and that it's false conversions or whatever else. But they're trying to basically say, hey, listen, we're bringing people to Christ. It's not a shock to us, it's only a shock to you. But so no matter what the critics say, and that term righteous rock, that became something that was coined early on and used frequently, especially by the artists that of the Jesus movement and even beyond, to kind of describe themselves and their ministries and how they felt what they were doing for Christ and their music. Then we get to the longest spoken portion that they have in their music, and this is kind of how they end the song, and it's a conversation between Dr. Livingstone and Stanley. Now, if you're not familiar with those, you can look those up, plenty in history, explorers to Africa, and that would be kind of to the area in the late 1800s, 1870s, something like that, where Stanley went out and found Livingstone. And he's famous for saying, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. So this is written from their perspective out in Africa. And so that's how this section begins. So after Stanley says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Livingstone then replies, and I'm not going to try to do my impression of that, but it says, why, Stanley, old chap, did you bring those rock and roll tapes I requested? So they're out in the jungle, and you can't get a lot of music out here, and so Stanley is basically bringing him music to listen to. And so they begin to talk about what Stanley brought, and that's where the references to other artists begin. So he says, brought some Resurrection Band, and the reply, of course, I was awaiting your reply. And, of course, one of the albums for Res Band is Awaiting Your Reply. And then he says he lost some Daniel Amos along the way. And, of course, the reply is, oh, Alarma. And one of the Daniel Amos albums was Alarma. Then there's a double reference here for DeGarmo Key. It says, I did manage to get some DeGarmo Key this time through. And of course, one of their albums is This Time Through. And the reply from Livingstone is, splendid. This ain't Hollywood. You know, you can't get any decent rock and roll out here. And so the album This Ain't Hollywood from DeGarmo Key is referenced there. Now there's a reference to Barnabas. The only thing about that in this case is I can't really seem to find a music reference to go along with it, so I don't know if he's just using Barnabas as the biblical reference and name, or whether they are actually referencing Barnabas the band. So that would be something I would have to ask them, why there was no reference to a music composition or album. But it does go on to say a reference to Petra as far as Barnabas was concerned. So the reply is that, well, you know, Barnabas, he has this never say die attitude. And of course, Never Say Die was a Petra album. And then he says he's studying petroglyphs in Egypt. So that would be your Petra reference there. And then there's kind of an odd, a little bit forced to me, out of place reference. There's a band, Fireworks, so he asks if he's got any fireworks. And the reply is, oh, no, you can't do that because they shatter the darkness. They scare off all the animals, etc. So one of the Fireworks albums, Shatter the Darkness, would be referenced there. And then there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of a misunderstanding between the two, that he suggests some sweet comfort. And of course the reply is, oh yes, I'd love to have some sweet comfort. Hang on, hold on tight. I'm going to get the glasses and I'll be breaking the ice. So in essence, references two albums there, says hold on tight. And then of course you get the glasses, and then the second album, I'll be breaking the ice being the album there. And then there's a reference to themselves, and their album Shallow Water is mentioned. And then Livingstone basically uses that servant reference and says two of his servants ran away. They were named Larry and Normandy. Of course, Larry Norman is a huge artist from the Jesus movement. We'll be talking about plenty. And then he says the servants are now in another land, which would have been one of Larry Norman's albums, so In Another Land. So tons of references there, and that actually how it kind of concludes. And we'll be looking at a lot of these bands, we'll be looking at a lot of these songs and albums, so this is really kind of a jumping off point for us to really kind of go even deeper into some of the early Christian music. And there's plenty of one-liners here, especially if you're looking to just throw something as a reference. I definitely use the DeGarmo Key when in conversations when I say, this ain't Hollywood. And so I'd like to hear in the comments basically, let me know your experiences, either with Servant or this time during Christian music, and the clash between Christendom and the artists. And remember to like, remember to subscribe, and make sure that you get additional videos. And we'll see you in the next episode of The Christian Record.